Okay, Doug just gave a fabulous introduction to the issue of urban heat island, and I'm going to show you a lot of pictures. So, why is the environmental performance of public space really important? And it is very simply because it's probably going to have the most impact on the multiple publics that have the least ability to respond to it. And as Doug has pointed out, it really is exacerbated. The heat island effect is exacerbated by air pollution from congestion, emissions from power generation of fossil fuels. And you can also see the impacts from severe storms resulting in flooding and storm surges, extreme heat island and drought, heat waves and droughts from climate change. And this is all exacerbated by the heat island effect. Now, how many people know that 700,000 people died in the heat waves in Central Europe in 2003? That's a big number. And this is Brian Stone's quote that Doug recited earlier. So I'm going to argue that the environmental performance of the public realm is probably the most underdeveloped design opportunity to change this equation. I don't want to focus, normally I would focus on this problem along with many, many other problems. This is an integrated whole systems design problem. It's about transportation, energy, water, waste, and food. But we're going to talk primarily about the heat island effect. Doug pointed out what causes it. We have reduced evaporation, cooling, because we have impermeable surfaces. We have high absorption of solar radiation because of the dark surfaces. We have something called the urban canyon effect, where solar radiation is bounced multiple times and given more chance to be absorbed and converted into heat. We have all the waste heat from buildings, cars, trucks, buses, and people, etc. And then also, we have reduced local wind ventilation because of the dense urban fabric. What's interesting about this is every single city, every street, every block is its own microclimate. So you really have to understand the principles of how these work. So when you're designing to reduce temperatures, you understand how these surfaces work. So this is an important slide. It lists the latent potential of environmental performance provided by the public space of cities, the green infrastructure. If you look, these are the ones that we normally think of. Public space of cities has been primarily for transportation, all forms. It's the community space with parks and plazas and streets. It's also the place where we have recreation. Look at all these other potential functions. Changes the microclimate, it absorbs pollution, absorbs CO2, it can treat stormwater, it can treat wastewater, it creates food, habitat, it can create biomass for energy. And the aesthetic dimension, in many cases, it's just visual, but in fact, there's smell, touch, taste, that's all part of this. The trouble is, we normally think of cities in plan, which I just showed you. If you think of the city in section, and you imagine all of these surfaces and the possibilities that they have for environmental performance, it is really transformative. Suddenly, you think of the public space of cities very, very differently. I've tried to organize this with a bunch of possibilities. You can see, you can treat the facade with green materials. You can generate energy on the roofs. You can rethink this whole public space in terms of how it functions with trees, storm water absorption, etc., and you can actually grow food in your backyard. So let's talk about these surfaces. Once you think of the surfaces of the city as possible drivers, design drivers that can change things, look at the options that we have. So if you think about the problem that Doug said about parking in cities, you can change the material of parking lots. In some cases, it averages anywhere from 30 to 60% of the horizontal surfaces of cities could be changed to this kind of material. Think of the transportation corridors that normally are paved, and they can become green with both shading and the ability here to absorb water, to create evaporative cooling, and to lower the temperature of this whole public space. What's interesting is, and obviously sidewalks, the same thing. If you look at the functions, it tempers the climate, it absorbs stormwater, recharges groundwater, it's a carbon sink. But look at these co-benefits. Improves comfort, saves air conditioning costs, you don't have to replace the storm water system when we have these severe storms, improves health, and it enhances the senses. You can start to see these things. I won't go over the tree things. Doug did a great job of explaining. They are really probably one of the most cost-effective things any city can do with all of these co-benefits. Now, he talked about green walls being expensive. This is true, but a study in Phoenix showed that if you added trees, put green walls on all of the first 3 floors in a 9-block area, changed the paving material, and painted the roofs white, you could lower the temperature in that city 15 degrees centigrade, so 7 degrees C. So suddenly, that part of the city was habitable. It wasn't uninhabitable. So these are important tools in our toolkit. Obviously, green roofs, they can be aesthetic, they can be wonderful gardens, and so on. Again, they have all of these co-benefits along with these functions. What about urban agriculture? What's really important about this is it can happen on the ground, it can happen on roofs, and it can happen in walls. It also creates an internal economy in your neighborhood. Can feed local food markets, etc. If you then look at stormwater treatment, in San Francisco, the sewage system is a combined sewage and water system. Now with the increased, even though we have a drought, we also have terrible storms in San Francisco, and the sewage system overflows. If you treated the stormwater as part of the street, you wouldn't have to replace the stormwater system. This is billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure cost saved. Again, look at the co-benefits. What about wastewater? So Doug mentioned that if you want to green your city, in many cases, there's a water shortage. It turns out that you can treat the wastewater in buildings using this hybrid engineered natural system called the living machine, and locally water all the trees on your street with this system. Or you can have your park be your sewage treatment plant. These are 2 parks in Tianjin, China, and they are sewage treatments for these buildings. What's also interesting is the imaginative way in which you can introduce green systems into the public space of cities. This is in Zurich. It's in many ways a green cathedral. It uses a very lightweight metal structure in order to be able to grow all these living plants and make a green space in the city. You can imagine if you use these more systemically in neighborhoods to create whole walls. So suddenly the street wall was not just glass, but could be green and completely change the albedo effect of the street and would have all the co-benefits that we talked about, absorbing carbon, tempering the microclimate. They can even grow things here. Now this is in the global south. What's really interesting about these slides is you can use local materials to create a growing infrastructure, or you can use technology to do this. And these folks are treating their wastewater and using it to irrigate the urban agriculture that creates an internal economy. We've seen in some of the new designs, this is all done by Arup for Abu Dhabi, Masdar. And you can see the idea that suddenly the canopy of cities is being rethought. And they're learning from the souks, they're learning from ancient cities that had to cope with their climate naturally by suddenly thinking of ways to shade the canopy of public space. Now just think about this in light of what Doug said. These light canvases reflect the solar radiation directly back to space, as well as giving a kind of dappled light here. Now let me ask you, how many of you have decorations in the holiday season in your cities where they put up lights? Just about everybody? What happens to those streets? They become rooms, they become spaces, they become public spaces of identity. We could just as easily do this in the summertime and create a microclimate in those spaces that would guard against the heat island effect. So, in general, if you look at the ground, the canopy, the facades, the roofs, the courtyards, these are ripe areas for design innovation, and we just have not done enough research about how these things can operate as we try to mitigate against climate change and the heat island effect. Also, so this is a little statement that I made for urban designers. It's not just the figure ground, it's the section that really becomes the site of environmental performance. And it allows us to rethink each of the surfaces to adapt to climate change, mitigate the heat island, and create a more livable and equitable city. And it's a totally expanded toolkit for urban design, for the mayors, for the planning committees, et cetera, and for people. So the most interesting challenge, I think, relates to what was talked about this morning. And that is, who has dominion over these surfaces? And how can you tactically improve their environmental performance? So we've seen the beginnings with government, where cities are starting to say we want to have 25% tree cover. We've also seen the idea that we need to have a certain percentage of the area of cities be in green space. And then there's some very imaginative ideas about green factors or green area ordinances, where you say a certain percentage of all the surfaces has to be vegetative or living. And it doesn't matter if it's the roof, the facade, the garden, the parking. You have a certain percentage, which is a way to start to zone these things, as well as distance from parks or green plazas. So what about the private sector in all of this? If you look at some of the examples, most of the innovative examples have been experiments on buildings, in part as a sort of aesthetic idea, but also as an environmental idea. So the private sector has really funded pilot projects and experimental installations, and they can provide creative financing. But what about NGOs and grassroots organizations? I think this is where the public space of cities can really come alive. If you have been in China and you go to these super blocks, and they're single purpose, all residential super blocks, and you go there and they're brand new, you go there 5 years later, and on the ends and the edges, you have all of the services and commercial activities that were planned out originally, and usually in every square inch of the city, they're growing bok choy or vegetables. They've turned that space into an internal economy. So I would argue that it's this area and these kinds of activities, which in some cases are rogue activities in the city, are a natural way to actually address the urban heat island effect while you're dealing with local food and creating a local economy. So what I would argue is that we're just on the beginning of understanding how we can use all of these new ideas and tools to remake the city so we don't end up with the kind of situation that Doug implied, which is we have a heat island effect, the cities become intolerable, only the poor folks can stay there, and everybody moves out of the city. What really is critical is that we improve the quality of the cities, and we have to do it, I think, by using some of these tools, which is really a more aggressive application of green infrastructure. Thank you.